I want to talk about still a poverty program, impact evaluation, and I want to talk about microfinance. And I'm going to try to do this very quickly because there's actually a lot of material to cover later on inequality. And probably most of you have heard about microfinance program. It was made most famous by the Grameen model by Muhammad Yunus in Bangladesh. And there was some very famous studies published in the top journals of economics, which suggested that these programs delivered very large income and consumption benefits. But then, as I mentioned last time, there was a recent symposium published in 2015 of studies in 6 different countries that were based on randomized control trials, not observational studies. And none of them found significant effects on income and consumption. So it raised this huge issue. Maybe we haven't been really thinking clearly about the impacts of these programs. And some of the factors that the authors of the overview chapter of that special issue mentioned as reasons why microfinance programs may not be having big effects on incomes include the low take-up or differential take-up, that maybe people in these places already have some access to credit, so just providing them with a new program at the margin doesn't really have a huge effect. That there's a lack of credit demand. So actually, sorry, take-up actually means you offer them the product and for whatever reason, they just don't accept the offer. And it could be related to lack of knowledge of the product or concerns about the interest payments or whatever. Related to the second one, which is lack of credit demand, because they have access already to credit. Also, that loans are not just used to make income. A lot of loans are used to smooth consumption, so you wouldn't really expect an income effect. And that sometimes in certain contexts, the loans are often used to finance some entrepreneurial activity, self-employment activity, and this in some places this means that people just move their labor from the wage market to the self-employment market, and it doesn't have a huge effect on total incomes. And then there's also criticism of some of the features of the loan products being offered, that they require lots of meetings to repay every week, and this introduces costs that people don't like, and it reduces risk-taking. And that there could be spillover effects, which also reduce the estimated impacts of the program. Okay, so China. So I'm going to skip a lot of the background and just get to the program. We do a randomized control trial in China, and the Chinese government initiated a large-scale microfinance program where it created village-level credit institutions and gave them money and said, you can elect your own leaders of this credit organization, and you can decide yourself how large loans should be, how long they should be for. So fairly decentralized. And the national government by 2011 had invested $500 million in these programs. And it's been estimated by the end of that year, 16,000 villages across the country had gotten these injections of money from the government. So it's typically 200,000 renminbi per village, or 30,000 US dollars. And we were able to work, mainly my co-author, Wang Sangui, who's a longtime co-author of mine on issues related to poverty in China, worked with the National Program Leading Group on Poor Area Development Office in China to actually do a randomized control trial to assess how their own programs were working. So this is the same design exactly as the programs that were being scaled up nationally. And we did the experiment in 5 provinces, 2 counties in each province. And then in each county, we randomly selected 3 treatment villages and 2 control villages. And within each village, we randomly selected 30 households. So we have a total sample of 1,500 households. And we did a baseline survey, did the program, and then did a follow-up a couple of years later. Okay, so this is location. I'm going to kind of, well, the loans were relatively short, mostly 1-year loans. There's just one repayment at the end. It's not weekly repayment. It was done in groups of 5 to 7 households. So that's kind of like the Grayman model. The take-up rate was about 28% of households in the villages. And everyone, I think, was basically allowed to participate. They just needed to sign up. The repayment rate was nearly 100%. Okay, so because it's a randomized control trial, the econometrics is very simple. It's just OLS regression where we focus on the intent to treat effect. We just literally compare changes in income and poverty rates in the treated villages compared to the control villages, controlling for some individual and village characteristics, county dummy variables. So we're just making comparisons within county between the treatment and control villages. And then the beta captures the intent to treat effect. And of course, you could use treatment as an instrument for whether people actually got a loan. And then you could estimate the treatment on the treated effect, which is typically larger. But in a lot of RCTs these days, people don't like to estimate the treatment on the treated effect because they're worried that there are spillovers. If you look at households that got the loan in a village, they could be also lending some of the money back to other people in the control group. And so there's problems in interpreting the treatment on treatment effect in the context of spillover. So people are cautious, and so they just estimate literally, were you in a program village? Did you have potential access? Not whether you actually got the loan. So that's the intent to treat effect. And then we do typical balance tests. And I'm going to just jump to the results. It increased borrowing substantially. And then here's kind of the punchline here, is that if you look at the overall treatment effects on income, there's a huge increase in income of 4,000 renminbi in household income, where the mean in the baseline is 8,000. So it's like a 50% increase in income. And that's just the intent to treat effects. So there were large effects. And you can see that there are positive effects both for self-employment income and for employment income. In the Chinese context, what's happening is a lot of people are out migrating, right? They're using the money to finance migration to very remote places. Maybe if you're in the middle of the country, you go to a big booming coastal city and get a job in a factory, right? So that's interesting. So total income increases, and then we can also break it down into types of income. So there's an increase in the land sown to cash crops. That makes sense, since cash crops will be more input intensive and require working capital. And then there's increase in inputs for feed and livestock. There's an overall increase in labor supply in terms of the total working days. And then in particular, it's really an increase in the migrant working days. And because all of this is pretty well paid in the migrant labor market, this actually generates quite a lot of income, because it's more work days, not just higher paying jobs, but actually higher paying jobs compared to zero income, right? If you look at the incremental increase in the working days. Okay, so I'm jumping through this kind of quickly, and it turns out that it's all driven, this wage income benefit is all driven by this pretty distant migration outside of your own province. Okay, and then the poverty punchline is that the intent to treat effect is a 17% reduction in the poverty rate compared to a 45% poverty rate at baseline control. So big poverty reduction impacts. But why do we see these effects in China when all of these other countries found very little effect? And what we did is we tried to do a meta-analysis where we just looked at all of the countries in that special issue. We also add this very well-known study by Robert Townsend in Thailand, which is not a RCT, but they use random variation in the per capita fund availability of a program that's actually very similar to the Chinese program, where the state banks endowed village credit funds in different villages, similar to in China. And one thing you can find is that if you look at the impacts on self-employment income compared to employment income, you can see, I mean, in China, there's kind of decent sized impacts on both. In other places, you see that this trade-off, like for India and in Mongolia, you see that there's actually a reduction in self-employment income. I'm sorry, a reduction in employment income and a slight increase in self-employment income. And so there's this kind of trade-off given the features of the labor market. It suggests that it's pretty easy to get the off-farm job. So if you get a better self-employment opportunity, you're just moving labor around. You're not actually increasing total labor supply like we found in China. You can also see that there's a lot of differences in take-up. So if you compare the take-up in treatment versus control, in China, we have this 28% take-up. Some of the others, like India, have a pretty low take-up. Mexico, Morocco. So some of these countries, you could argue maybe they just have a low take-up because they're all intent to treat effects. So low take-up rate is going to directly reduce impact. And then you can also see that all of the other programs have some kind of weekly or monthly repayment. China's is yearly. The interest rates too, some of these other programs have very high interest rates. China's interest rate is very low, it's about 9%. And finally, there's this kind of baseline activity of the time that people are allocating to employment activity as opposed to self-employment activity. And you can see that in China, it's fairly low. Some of the countries, but some it's fairly high. So these are pretty well-developed labor markets where maybe there's going to be less of an income effect of just finance for activity, right? So in China, this might be surprising that China has a low employment to self-employment ratio, but it's really a function of the sample because this is our poor rural, they're all poor rural villages. They're not typical villages, they're poor villages. And so they're in remote locations, so they tend to be more agricultural and not as clicked into the big migrant labor market in China. That's why the loans are actually benefiting them. They're allowing them to finance this out-migration. So there's clues here. And then one thing we did is we can actually do very, like literally regressions with country observations, which are really just correlations, right? To see if any of these differences reported in that meta table are correlated with the differences in the impacts on total income or self-employment, total income, and then also by self-employment and employment income. And you do find some correlations so, you know, if you repay more frequently, then the effects on total income are smaller. If you have a higher interest rate, the effects on income are smaller. If you have more households that already have access to bank loans at baseline, the effects of treatment are smaller, especially for self-employed income. And then in terms of this ratio of time allocated to employment and self-employment, if you're in a more kind of agricultural focus or non-employment focused economy or environment, this also reduces the income effects, right? Especially the employment income effects. So, and a similar relationship occurs within the villages in the Chinese sample. So we look at a heterogeneity test where we also find that the effects on this is a bit cut off. So if we look at by labor market friction, if we look at the county level ratio of employment to self-employment, we find that there are bigger effects on employment income. If you have, sorry, this is if you have more employment. So basically, if you have fewer people already in wage employment, then the effects are bigger than if you have a lot of people already who have kind of shifted to the off-farm labor market. And then also access to loans also reduces the program income. So there's the message here is that the punchline, if you will, of this, and trying to explain the positive effects in China is that the context matters. Like one thing that's unfortunate about a lot of the discussion of RCT results is that people say, oh, we did something in this country, so it works. And therefore, they think other countries should do the same thing because obviously I've already proven that it works. But I think there's quite a few development economists who are very uncomfortable with the external validity of making these types of claims, that just because school uniforms works in one country doesn't mean it's going to work in some other country. The context could be very different here. And so I think this meta-analysis is pointing out that you really have to look at the context, because in China, there could be just a lot of things that are, the environment is very ripe for microfinance to have big income effects, which don't exist in the other places where microfinance was done. And the other countries are not finding income effects. We believe they're kind of for different reasons for each country. It's not always the same reason, right? So in China, you see it's a place where, at least for these poor villages, there was very low formal borrowing before the program. There was a very high take-up rate when the program was introduced. It had one-time repayment rather than a frequent repayment. And there was a big increase in wage employment earnings from migration, which helped generate much larger income effects. And this could be because in China, there's exceptionally high demand for migrant labor because of the booming economy on the coast. That also migration is liquidity constrained. We've also, in other work, my former student in his paper in the JD shows that migration impacts are driven mainly by the impacts in places that are poor, have lower wealth, which makes sense if it's a liquidity story. So yeah, so this is restating kind of my comments about thinking about more carefully about external validity of RCT studies. Okay, any questions about this before I move on to today's lecture topic? So I'm going to unshare this. All right, so I want to talk about inequality for the rest of today's lecture and move away from poverty. And I'm going to make I want to make some general points about measurement of inequality, like I did about poverty last time. And then I want to present some results for China, and then also then talk to intergenerational mobility as a key dimension of inequality that I think has been getting quite a lot of attention. And I think it's because people feel that, in some sense, intergenerational mobility really helps capture this notion of inequality of opportunity, which is kind of the type of inequality in some ways that we care the most about in terms of its welfare and justice implications. Okay, so this is just a picture from a paper that just was published in AEJ Policy by Fan Yi and Zhang, where first they have this figure which plots the Gini coefficient, which is the red lines. Okay, so, and the data comes from different sources, but the most from 2003 on, it's coming from the National Bureau of Statistics in China. And you can see that the Gini estimates kind of peak in about 2008 or so, and then has been gradually declining, which of course is a great trend, and declining from, maybe 0.49 at the peak, and now it's down to 0.46 or so. So there's been this gentle decline in the last 5 years to the last year of this data, at least. And of course, China's been growing very rapidly. So most of this period, you see high growth accompanying a very rapid increase in inequality in China, with a leveling off and slight reduction in the more recent period. Okay. So one point I want to talk about is thinking about Gini estimates, because there was a controversy about the Gini coefficient in China maybe some years ago, when some scholars used data from this very large national survey called the China Household Finance Survey, and they said the Gini coefficient in China was 0.61, I think. And this created got a lot of attention in the media, and people said, oh, and there was a backlash basically. So it was really because of this controversy that the Chinese Bureau of Statistics started to release Gini coefficient estimates for the first time. And then they did it retrospectively all the way back to 2003, but they had never published a Gini coefficient estimate before this controversy because they were combating this idea that China had become, as unequal as South Africa. And the CHFS data that was used to produce that estimate is an interesting data set because the people who ran the survey, I know pretty well, they really claim that they made a much stronger effort to interview people in high income neighborhoods and to really get them to increase the response rate of higher income individuals. So they think that the estimates are reasonable. And then it raises this issue, which has come up in measurement, not just in China, but elsewhere, about how to deal with, how to come up with Gini estimates that are not overly sensitive to outliers in top income. So the point is that the actual Gini for a country will really be affected a lot by how many Bill Gateses or Mark Zuckerbergs there are, but typically these people don't show up in household surveys at all. And in general, the number of observation at the very top of the distribution of a survey could vary fairly randomly. Even if people responded who were asked to be interviewed, it could be that you just randomly run into some huge trillionaire in one survey, and another survey you don't run into that guy. And given that the sample sizes are limited, you can actually find that the Gini estimates for the whole country could be very unstable relative to the randomness of the incomes that you observe at the top of the distribution for any survey. I mean, even underreporting aside, just the randomness, when you're talking about a small percent of the distribution with limited sample size, you're not really sure if you can trust the survey sample for 1 year to estimate the Gini in a way that's going to be reliable and consistent over other years, right? Okay, so I just wanted to show some results from work on China that tries to employ methods that address this top income problem to create more stable estimates by using kind of fitted distributions to data. And so this is Kristina Buteyeva. This is her from her dissertation research. And so she proposes a new estimation method that's robust to this top income problem and applies it to the China Household Finance Survey, which is the data I just described that produced this very high Gini estimate. And then she also applies it to another very well-known household survey in China that's nationally representative, the China Family Panel Study. And she also does another robustness check by looking at how some information on some tax income data on top incomes can be used to also try to characterize the top of the distribution and to see if you kind of take that data seriously and make the right adjustment, then what happens to the overall Gini estimate. And it turns out that whatever you do under using these new methods, the results are actually fairly robust, and they replicate basically this high estimate reported earlier of China's Gini being more like 0.61. Okay, so the point of this method is to just divide the distribution of incomes into two parts. The mean of the distribution you can characterize with a non-parametric density function. And then for the upper tail, you use a weighted Pareto density. So you're assuming a kind of a functional form for the distribution. And you need a continuous function at the top because it'll be much more stable than just taking a few random points that you might happen to observe at the top. Okay. So it smooths out the distribution tail representation. And so this is it in math, that there is a threshold point tau. Below that, you fit a fairly flexible non-parametric CDF. And then to the right of the threshold, you do something that's a bit more parametric, a Pareto distribution. And the question is, how do you pick the threshold point in this methodology? And the way that Kristina does it is she picks different parameters of the Pareto function, first, one condition on the Pareto function that you need to fit is that there has to be a continuity at the threshold point, so that there's a continuous, that there's not a big jump or something right at the boundary point with the left side of the distribution. So there's a continuity assumption that has to be imposed on the feasible Pareto parameters. And the other thing is that if you believe the data that you do have on the top incomes, it has to some extent fit that data. So that is what she calls the empirical Pareto shape parameter. And then you pick a tau where the empirical Pareto and the feasible Pareto are basically in sync, where they're similar to each other, so that they're both consistent with the data you have and also meet the continuity assumption. And then you pick the threshold there, and then you just calculate the Pareto shape parameter, and then you calculate the Lorenz curves and the Gini coefficient. Okay, so that's a bit technical, but I really just want to convey the spirit of this. And here are the results for China. So the CHFS data, which is a very large data set, much bigger than the CFPS, it produces pretty stable estimates of a 0.61 range, right? In 2012, 2014, and 2016. These are multiple waves of this survey. And then what's interesting is she applies it to the CFPS data. That's a survey run out of Peking University. And she actually finds estimates which are also pretty high, 0.61, 0.59, 0.595. So not a huge disagreement. And you can see that these are somewhat higher than the estimates using just the raw data, which are on the lower panel, lower table 3, right? Okay, and then this is a summary of many different estimates of the Gini coefficient in China in the last decade, okay? And the dashed line just is trying to make a point that all of the estimates above the dashed line produce high Gini coefficients, but they also are really trying to account for top incomes in some way. And so even though the Gini coefficient in China using these methods do reach a high level, 0.61, it would be unfair to say that therefore China is like South Africa, because that would only be true if South Africa estimates also really dealt with a top income problem and weren't just done using survey data. If you were using normal survey data and just take the raw data at face value, then you're going to get numbers more similar to what's below the dashed line. And if that's the kind of calculations that are being done in South Africa or Brazil or other high inequality countries, then that's a fairer comparison. But just in terms of what the actual Gini is in China, I think there's some evidence that it's actually quite high. Okay, so this is just the punchline here. You can see this red line is the MBS estimates. The World Bank has even lower estimates of the Gini. There's a pretty famous paper published in the AER by Piketty about inequality in China, and they don't publish Ginis. They publish percentile ratio, like how much of income is earned by the top 10%, these types of things. But you can take their data, which is available, and some other people have done that. And if you use their data, it actually also implies really high Gini coefficients of over 0.65 or 6.4 in one case, or oh no, more like 0.7 looks like it's the square. So anyway, this is just kind of addressing some important issues about measuring income inequality and then applying it to China. Any questions about that? Okay, and then one other interesting point, and it's another essay in her thesis, is that you can actually use the same method and do it at the provincial level and say, oh, which provinces have high inequality? And then this figure just plots the inequality measurement at the province levels for different waves of the CHFS and plots it against the log of the GDP per capita, GRP per capita in the different provinces. And you can see there's this very clear downward slope, which means that richer provinces in China also are much more equal. And so poorer provinces have the double burden of being much poorer than richer places, larger regional gaps than in most countries, but also being much more unequal than the rich places. And if you get into why that is, what you find is that the poor provinces have much greater educational inequality in the population. In particular, the share of people with low levels of education is just much higher than in the rich province, which drives some of this overall higher increase in inequality. And it's also true that in poorer provinces in China, that they have higher returns to schooling, of course, which is going to magnify the income differences of more educated and less educated groups and contribute to the Gini. And this variation in the returns to schooling, of course, does reflect imperfect labor market integration, because if labor markets were perfect, if labor was perfectly mobile, you would expect the returns to education to be the same everywhere. And it suggests a shortage of highly educated workers in poor areas in a relative sense. Okay. So now I'm going to move to intergenerational mobility. What is intergenerational mobility? It's the simplest way to think about it is the correlation between the parent's economic status and the child's economic status. So is my future determined by who I was born to or what my parents were? Is my economic status basically going to be determined by the wealth of the income of my parents, as opposed to my own kind of accomplishments? That's kind of how it's discussed, and of course, it captures this idea of equality of opportunity that as it's been described by Rob Chetty, the American dream is that anyone can be president, right? No matter if you're the poorest person in the country or the richest. And if you think about what drives this correlation of parent and child incomes, we can think of different mechanisms. One obviously would be something that's genetic and ability, et cetera, that would link the outcomes of parents and children. The other would be parental investments, that richer parents can just make a lot more investments in their children, whether it be in terms of money, sending them to good schools, or also just imparting their wisdom, like literally talking to their kids and giving them more knowledge or giving them more support in various ways. And then a third mechanism is kind of the public service component, that there could be quite a lot of inequality in access to basic health and education services or other types of opportunities that just differ if you have rich parents or poor parents or live in rich areas versus poor areas. Now, empirically, a lot of people have estimated what's called the intergenerational income elasticity, which is a simple regression of a child's income on the income of his or her parents, or father or mother or parents, right? And this actually, when you think about it, has quite a high data demand, because means you need income data on both the parents and the children, right? And of course, in some surveys, if parents and children are living together, then you might ask questions about the income of the parents and the child, but you probably will be asking their incomes at very different ages, right? And it could be that the parent is already retired and you're not really getting their peak income, and it could be the child is still very young and you're not really capturing their peak income. And so there's a bunch of measurement issues. And if they don't live together in the same household, then very few surveys can accurately measure the incomes of non-residents, right? Even if they ask, they may not actually even know very well what the income is of people who don't live with them. And there has to be a special survey designed to go after them, right? Now, of course, these problems can be solved if you can get linked income data from public sources like US tax data, which is what Chetty and Hendren have done and produced a lot of influential research using this tax data income. Of course, even the tax data, the income from tax data is not going to be completely accurate because people don't report all of their income. But of course, it's a very valuable resource. And I believe maybe in some Scandinavian countries too, where there's enormous administrative data, something like this may be possible as well. Although I haven't really seen a whole lot of that kind of research from those countries yet. All right, now there's a bunch of, so this simple regression is it's not even causal, right? It's really a correlation. But even so, it has estimation issues. One is a life cycle bias issue. This is what I was mentioning before, that that it could be very sensitive to the age at which you're measuring the income of parents and the age at which you're measuring the income of children. You would like, in principle, to know people's lifetime incomes, right? The income every year, measure something that's close to a permanent income of parents and a permanent income of children, and then look at the correlation. But we don't have that. We only have it for some years. And so people often try to address that by controlling for age in the regressive age of parents, age of children, quadratics of age, polynomials of age. But there's some work that shows that this does not completely remove the problems associated with it. Because it's not an age function. When, I know working in data in China that when you're younger, still the wage differences are very compressed, right? You don't really see the big income differences start to get noticeable until you've been in the labor market for a while. Okay, the second problem is attenuation and bias. This is just simply the idea that, income is measured very noisily, a lot of measurement error. And also incomes can fluctuate for real reasons from year to year, like the weather affects the harvest or whatnot. And so to try to get a sense of the real income status of parents and children, it's good to have multiple income measurements. A lot of researchers have tried to find panel data where they have multiple income measurements for the same people and average them. At least that reduces to some extent both the income measurement noise and the variability noise that can affect the estimates of the economic status of parents and children. And finally, in many contexts, depending on the survey and depending on the data source, there can be selection bias, because usually surveys lack data on non-resident family members or those temporarily migrating out of the household. And so you can use Heckman's selection correction term. So in the paper I'm going to present in a second on China, that's what they do. They estimate an income equation, income as a function of a bunch of variables. And then they also estimate an equation for whether income is observed or not in the data. And then they use a correction term to kind of get the right income equation estimate. And then they use that to predict the incomes of everybody in the sample, all parents and children, whether or not income is observed. And using this kind of predicted income, then they go ahead and do the correlate, they run this regression, right? So obviously the difficulty here is that if you don't observe someone's income and you're predicting it based on some regression, that's fine in terms of if you have a lot of very rich data, but there's still going to be a problem that there's going to be an unobserved component that could be correlated with the kid's income that's going to be related to the parent's income. So the best example would be genetics, right? We can't put genetics into the regression, but it could be important, right? And so the bias could be systematic if we're just trying to predict people's parents' income based on observable characteristics. But anyhow, people do that given the data limitations. Questions are too important not to study, right? Okay, so now let me show you some results from this paper that was just published in AEJ Policy by Fan Yi and Zhang, which the title I think is Rising Income Persistence in China. So they're measuring intergenerational income mobility, and they're arguing that if you look at earlier cohorts and the later cohorts, that the persistence is actually increasing in China. So these figures just show, plot the parent's income rank on the x-axis and the average child's income rank in the y-axis. And you can see there's a positive correlation. The slope of that line is really the intergenerational income correlation, rank correlation here. And one thing that's interesting is if you compare the left side is people born 1970 to 1980. The right side is those born 1981 and 1988. And you can see that the slope of the fitted line, I think, is the same, but the fit is much tighter in the later cohort to the line. So there seems to be a much stronger prediction of the parent's income rank to the child's income rank. And also you see this, the top of the distribution seems to be very predictive. So this is a bit concerning. This is saying the very richest people, really their children are also the very richest. That correlation is highest at the top of the income distribution. Okay, this is using the China Family Panel Study, which is the data set I mentioned before, run out of Peking University. Okay, and then basically when they estimate these regressions and they correct for selection bias in the way discussed, these are the estimates. If you do this log regression and calculate the intergenerational elasticity, you get 0.39 for the early cohort, 0.44 for the late cohort. So this is why they argue that the correlation between parents and children's income is increasing over time. People born later, their incomes are more strongly correlated with their parents than people born earlier. And that's true. You can calculate a correlation, you can do a rank correlation, and the basic finding holds, right? So the greater correlation means that income mobility, being able to move, beyond where your parents were, that mobility has declined over time. There's a greater persistence of intergenerational incomes. And I think the results are done, the analysis is done fairly competently, but I think it still leaves a lot of questions on how to interpret this. So for example, it could just be that in the earlier cohorts, because China is such a dynamic economy that it's undergoing so many structural changes. So the parents' world is so different than the children's world, and the parents' distribution of educations is so different than the children's distribution of educations, that I think some of these types of measurements can really be affected by kind of the distribution of parents' education, for instance. Could be much lower in the earlier cohort than in the later cohort. And therefore, you're going to see more mobility almost by definition. So the results are real, but the interpretations are open to thinking about, because you really don't know what's driving it, right? So maybe a policymaker would say, I'm really concerned about this, but maybe the mechanism that explains this is not really a mechanism that is something that should be the main focus of policy. So I still think this paper is a good starting point for raising questions, but I think it is pretty far from answering them in a convincing way. Okay, and then the other thing that they do in the paper, which is kind of interesting, is they plot what's called the Gatsby curve. Maybe Steve Durloff talked about this. If you plot the Gini coefficient, the level of inequality on the x-axis and the intergenerational elasticity of income, and these different points are for different provinces or different education groups or different cohorts, all plotted together. And then just want to point out that there is an increasing slope to this, that in subgroups that have higher inequality, you see you see a higher intergenerational elasticity, which means less mobility, which is consistent with part of the Gatsby curve hypothesis. And the other result that they find when they do some heterogeneity analysis is that they find that intergenerational mobility is greater for boys and those living in richer areas, in urban areas and coastal provinces. So the poor girls living in the poor provinces, in the rural areas, really have the lowest mobility, right? Which obviously should be of some concern. Okay.
Hi, Prof. Can I ask one question?
Sure.
So I was just wondering, I don't know if they're related, but is it possible that as an economy kind of converges towards steady state growth rate, it also kind of somehow plays a role in the mobility kind of being less across generations? Are they kind of related concepts, or
Yeah, I think it's a plausible hypothesis. It really is under research, to be honest. I believe that in in an economy that's transforming and going through lots of structural change and rapid growth, I think you're going to see more mobility, generally speaking. And then, if once you become an advanced economy, some of the processes should stabilize out, and you're likely to see less mobility. But that's such a big generalization. It leaves so many questions unanswered, right? About
Right.
whether that has to be that way. And but I think you can imagine many stories that would lead to that, right? So for example, because I've done some work, I'm going to show you, hopefully if I have time later. I've been doing these rural surveys in a poor rural province in China, in Gansu province in the western part of the country. And we have been following a cohort of children for a long time. And now they're all in the labor market. So we actually can generate these intergenerational correlations for this sample of rural children. And there's really high mobility. Like there's a very low correlation with the income of their parents when they were young and their incomes today. And partly I think it's because, they're not doing anything that their parents are all farmers and they're all migrant workers working away. So they're not learning anything about their jobs from their parent. Their lives are completely different. So it kind of makes sense to me, right, that that there isn't a whole lot of association between what they're doing and their incomes and their parents, or that would be lower in a place where migration is really a new opportunity compared to for the younger generation. So maybe that's an example that in a transition or a structural change process, some of these things you may see more opportunities for mobility. But it could be kind of a China specific story. I think you'd have to, there's all sorts of other work on poverty traps and other things where you could say,
Right.
oh, in many countries, but often the poverty trap stories are more salient in poor countries that are not really growing fast and are not really dynamic, of which there still are, still many, obviously. Any
Okay,
other
thank you.
questions? Okay,
Thank you.
great. Yeah. Okay, so I gotta keep my eye on the time. Okay, so in the remaining time, I want to talk about some work done by Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren, because this is really famous work. It's been really influential, and I think I'm going to do this because I think it's worth studying if you care about inequality and intergenerational mobility. And these authors are terrific because they actually provide the slides on their websites, right? You can actually, I downloaded, these are their slides, not my slides. I've just copied them over. But I want to make a few points because then I want to shift the context to China and present some estimates from research I've been doing that kind of looks at the same question about how does childhood poverty affect your future outcomes, right? Okay, so this work, as I mentioned, is based on tax data. So the question they have these two papers published in the same issue of the Quarterly Journal of Economics. So at the bottom of the slide, it says the first paper is the impacts of neighborhoods on intergenerational mobility, childhood exposure effects. And then they do a second paper where they look at the impacts of neighborhoods and they look at county level estimates. They literally look at how does living in every county in the US increase your income if you grew up in that neighborhood, and then try to associate it with characteristics of those communities, which is all predictable, like poorer communities, less educated communities, are going to do worse, right? High crime communities are going to do worse. And those effects tend to be much more pronounced for boys than for girls in terms of affecting their future incomes. But here in the first paper, they're just trying to say, look, if you move, they have this quasi-experimental evidence where they look at families that move from one neighborhood to another neighborhood. And they want to see if moving neighborhoods actually changes your trajectory. to see if that can increase your, like if you move from a worse neighborhood measured purely by the income of people in that neighborhood, and you move to a richer neighborhood and grow up there, does that actually make your income higher? So how important is the quality, in some sense, or wealth of your neighborhood in terms of affecting your own outcome? And they just look at kids and families that move, right? And they use it to estimate the causal effect of these moves on the children's earnings or rank in the income distribution. So they conceptualize neighborhood effects as the sum of the effects of different geographies. So this is very US context specific. You have the commuting zone, the county, the zip code, and the block. This is a census block. And so the commuting zones are the biggest unit. And you can think of that at each of these levels, there could be characteristics that will affect your expected income, this mu NBHD, right? They focus mostly on the commuting zone estimates, but then they also do county level estimates. And so, for example, this is just an example of what they do. They take a community. So these are kids in Chicago, okay? Let's say you're born and raised in Chicago. If you look at the rank of your parents' income in the national income distribution, and then compare it with your rank in the national income distribution, all of this kind of from linked tax data, you see this correlation, right? It's very strong. And the slope of this line is kind of telling you how much the incomes really, how strongly this effect is in this community, right? And one thing they do, which has been very influential, is that they actually do this for every, I think this is every county, where you can look at the intergenerational mobility and you can see some parts of the country have more mobility than others. So this is the predicted income rank at age 30 for children with parents at the 25th. This is 25th is from the bottom. So this is like from a relatively poor parent, what is the chance? What is the chance that you're going to be ranked at higher levels? And obviously, the light areas mean you're going to jump to a higher rank. So there's more mobility in the higher shaded areas, and the darker areas are the places where there's very little mobility. You're not going to go up. You're pretty much stuck at the bottom. And so you can see there's much less mobility in the south. There's more mobility in the north, especially in the middle of the country, which are less populated, generally regions. And it's a bit more mixed in the northeast and in the west. So there's a spatial dimension to mobility, right? And of course, then later they try to relate these to characteristics. Okay. Now, what about the neighborhood exposure effects? So the way they think about getting at this is thinking about a regression, right? So this is equation 1, where you have the income of the child, and then it's basically regressed on the average income of the permanent residents of where you grew up, right? So new neighborhood D at starting age M. And so if you move to a new place, then suddenly the effect, the effect could be different at different age, right? So if I move at age M, my effect is beta M. If I move at age M-1, the effect is beta M-1. I could be more sensitive to the income of my environment at different ages, okay? And then they're looking at movers, as I said, people who move across commuting zones. And the big problem, of course, is that where you move could be endogenous, right? It could be parents with certain characteristics are moving and parents with other characteristics are not moving, and children are. So maybe, for instance, children who move tend to be in more ambitious families, and so they tend to have higher incomes. It's not because they moved, it's because something about them that made them move. So parents who move to a good area may have latent ability or wealth that produces better child outcomes compared to like if you move to a poor area. Right? Okay, so if we think about what we care, we want to estimate is this beta M. What we do estimate in the data is BM, right? And it's going to include this true effect of the, it's going to include the true effect beta M of growing up in a neighborhood, but it's also going to have this theta M, which is a selection term, right? That maybe something about people who are moving to these areas, to richer areas, is different than people moving to poor areas, okay? And so they're going to focus, they're very concerned about this bias term, this selection problem in the identification here. And this delta M, I guess. And then, but they're going to point out that their identification strategy only requires that the selection affections do not vary with child's age at time of movement. In other words, as long as this self-selection is the same at all ages, that a high ability kid with high ability parents or something moving to richer areas versus poor areas, is that kind of selection is the same whether I move when I'm 3 years old or 4-year-old or 8-year-olds or 12 years old. That selection process is still going to be the case that the better families are moving to the better neighborhood. If that's true, then it's fine, because they're going to really try to compare the effects of movement of kids at different age and argue that that kind of difference in difference is going to sweep out any general consistent selection problem. So then they're going to run this regression. They're going to have fixed effects for where you started. So they're basically going to compare two kids. They come from the same county. They move to different places. One is rich, a richer county. One is poor. The destination, richer, has people who are richer than the poor place. And then they're going to say, what is the difference in that child's income later? So controlling for the origin, given different destination, what happens, okay? And what they find is that if you look at the difference in the destination compared to the origin, this is in the ranks, I believe, at the destination. So 0 would be the place you move to is the same as where you came from. 2 means it's 2 ranks greater on average. And you can see how does that affect the child's future rank in the national income distribution. There's this strong upward slope. So if you move to a better place, your expected income in the future is higher, right? So there's this strong neighborhood effect. And if you then, so this is for children who are age 13 at the time of the move, right? Then they do the same regression for kids who move at different ages, and they get this result. So each of these points in this figure is basically the slope estimate of this figure estimated for a sample of kids who moved at a different age, right? And so what you can see is the one that was just reported was at age 13. And it turns out that if you move at an earlier age, the effects of your neighborhood on your future income is much greater than if you move at a later age. In fact, you see this declining slope. The older you are when you move, the less benefit you get in terms of your future income rank of moving to a better neighborhood. And then above some point, you can see that it flattens out. And so what they're going to argue is that this flat part is the part that is the same for everybody, right? It's this selection term, and it's still positive. It's still the case that at every age, if you move to a richer place versus a poor place, you do a bit better. But at some point, it seems persistent. So this could be all self-selection, but the age-specific stuff, it's hard to argue that this is a result of selection because, unless you really think that parents who move when their kids are young, there's a much stronger selection than when the parents move when the kids are old. If you believe that, then that could still be a differential selection process. But otherwise, the difference between this gamma and the and this beta estimate is going to be what they're interpreting as the effect of the neighborhood, right? Okay. The other thing, so then they do some other things to try to make you convinced of the identification. One is that if you're worried about there's differences about families, then one thing they can do is just compare siblings because they have the same families, right? So you're controlling for any selection issue. And they find a very similar pattern when you look at sibling comparisons. And they also control for changes in income and marital status at the time of movement. So all these potential sources of bias, and the basic pattern is the same. And then they also are worried still about, there could be time varying unobservables that affect children in proportion to the exposure time that they have in the new communities. So they do a couple of additional tests. One is called an outcome-based placebo test, and another is an experimental or quasi-experimental variation test. And the outcome-based placebo test is basically saying if there's something general selection process that is explaining it, this should be a pretty persistent thing. And so it should persist across birth cohorts. And that since some areas, some counties are getting richer over time and some are getting poorer over time, that you can look at the neighborhood effect at the time when you moved and compare it to the neighborhood effect of kids who moved a little bit earlier or a little bit later from the same origin community, because a year earlier or a year later or 2 years earlier, 2 years later, the relative difference in the neighborhood quality is going to be different than when you moved, because every county's position is changing over time. And so if you have a persistent selection problem, it should be basically continue to be correlated whether you compare yourself to the neighborhood differences in your own year or those in the birth cohorts above and below you. And so they do this kind of a test, and they do this general test, which is a correlation. So at time 0, this is basically looking at the correlation in your future income and the neighborhood difference, quality difference at the time of your move. And then the ones to the right or the left are the differences in the neighborhood quality a year earlier or a year later from the time of your move. And you can see that because there is a correlation over time, you still get these correlations, but they weaken as you get farther. But the more interesting thing is when you actually put all of these in together, you basically look at what is the effect of these quality differences at each year difference from your own move, the year that you moved, then you get this effect. So this is a simultaneous estimation where you put them all in at once, and you can see that the only thing that really matters is the quality difference at the time that you move, not the quality difference occurring 2 years later or 2 years earlier. So that's suggesting that it is something about the quality that's specific to your move, to you, right? Effects on you. Okay. And I'm going to skip this last robustness check. Well, let me say one word. So they say that, okay, even if there are some selection effects related to, being richer, going to a richer place or a poorer place, there's also this factor that in some cities, there's a lot more upward mobility than other cities. So they compare Boston and San Francisco. Both of them have mean expected rank in the 46th percentile. So they look very similar in terms of quality. But in Boston, there's, in San Francisco, there's more upward mobility than in Boston. So even though they're similar level, if you go move in San Francisco, in general, people who are poor have a much bigger chance of getting to the top than in Boston, right? And so the question is, if I move to San Francisco compared to Boston, even controlling for the neighborhood quality difference, do I actually have a higher chance of getting into the top income in San Francisco than Boston? If that's the case, then that suggests it's really something about the difference between San Francisco and Boston, not something there's not something about the selection bias of me going to San Francisco or Boston, because these are basically equally rich cities. Okay, and that's what they do here. They look at the distribution prediction of basically the mobility in the destination area. Does that predict whether you get into the top 10%? and they find it does. And even when you control for just the quality difference of the neighborhood, it's still, you're more likely to get into the top of the distribution or the bottom of the distribution if you're in a place where that has more upward mobility or more downward mobility. Okay, so that's the other robustness check. So you can see it's a quite careful paper that's is trying to make a point, right? It's just the main point, of course, is that where you grow up really matters. And so moving to a better neighborhood is really going to increase your chances of mobility. And they've got great data, and then they're very careful to try to really test the robustness of these identifying assumptions. Okay. The other thing, they have another paper which is interesting because they're looking at this very famous moving to opportunity experiment. So this is actually a randomized trial done in 5 cities in the United States, 5 large cities, where people were randomly given housing vouchers, which allowed them to move to richer neighborhoods. And so because there's randomization, they can quickly do estimates of, did this really, going to a richer neighborhood, did it make you richer, right? And so, and what's interesting is they found that for adults who moved to new neighborhoods under this program, there was very little income effect. That's what previous research found. But now the kids have grown up from those families. And so what Chetty and Hendren and Katz do is they look at the children, not the adults who moved. They look at the children who moved and what happens when they become adults. And then they find big effects. So let me just go to the results. So they find that in terms of individual learnings, if you look at the control group, these are the non-movers, and the ones who got the voucher have significantly higher incomes. This is the intent to treat effect. This is the treatment on treatment, where you use the voucher as an instrument for whether you moved. So it's going to be bigger. This is just whether you got the voucher. And then what's interesting, this is for the kids who moved below age 13. But if you moved when you were between age 13 and 18, actually there's no effect. And in fact, there's a negative effect, but statistically insignificant effect. So their conclusion is that the key is growing up before age 13 in good neighborhoods has a lifetime beneficial effect, whereas later, really, the effects really dissipate quite a lot. So their argument that the policy implication is that one short-term solution to inequality is to provide targeted housing vouchers at birth, conditional on moving to better areas. And they argue this is actually going to be tax neutral because the vouchers actually generate tax revenue because people earn more money, and then it's not going to actually cost much to implement this, right? Okay, so that's the Chetty. Any questions about the Chetty stuff? All right, then I'm going to turn to China in the remaining time, which is about 10 minutes, unfortunately. Okay, so let me give you the context. So I have a couple of papers on looking at the long-term effects of poverty in rural China. And so one motivation here is that the US work that I just presented to you shows that neighborhoods seem to be important. But in developing countries, there's very little research on the role of neighborhoods in poverty work and analysis. There's also an interesting gender difference in the Western literature, which finds that boys are much more sensitive to growing up in disadvantaged families or in segregated communities, et cetera. But there's really no evidence on this in developing countries. Any of this, for the most part. Okay, so so we're looking at this in China, and I'm going to skip this and just go to the. So we did these surveys. I've been doing these surveys since the year 2000. So now 20 years ago, I started, and we started by surveying a cohort of children aged 9 to 12 in Gansu province in 20 counties, and we surveyed 2,000 kids, and we've been following these 2,000 kids. All in rural villages, not in urban areas, just rural. And we had a very interdisciplinary research team. So we got a lot of interesting questions, not just about economics, but also about non-cognitive skills, we did test scores, of course, as well. We had education specialists on the survey. And family relationships, parenting techniques, lots of sociological. The other PI was a sociologist. So we have a lot of different interesting variables. And we linked the surveys of the children to surveys of their parents, their homeroom teachers, their school principals, and their village leaders. So we have this whole linked design. And in particular, it allows us to get some information on neighborhoods. So this is the timeline of the survey waves. We started in 2000 at the kids were 9 to 12. We did another wave in 2004, 2007 and 9, and 2015 when the kids were mostly all in the labor market, aged 23 to 27. We hope to go back soon. Okay. By the way, this is a picture of me with one of the kids who's now grown up. He was a little kid, 9 to 12 when we started interviewing him, and that's his father. Okay. And then, so here we're going to define neighborhoods as either schools or villages, right? And we have questionnaires for every kid about the school they went to and the village that they grew up in. These are actual shots from Gansu. And then we have a lot of deprivation measures where we try to construct a multi-dimensional index of poverty, where we have family economic measures, family social, school economic, school social, village economic, village social, and all of the school and village indicators you can aggregate together and call this a neighborhood deprivation, right? And what we do is we determine some kind of a threshold line to determine whether you're poor with respect to all of those 38 indicators, and then calculate deprivation for each of the 6 domains, and then add them up. And if you're deprived, so within each domain, if you're deprived in 50% or more of the indicators, then we say you're poor in that domain. And then if you're deprived in 3 of the 6 domains, we say you're deprived overall in a multidimensional sense. So this, we call it a multi-context poverty indicator. And here you can see that based on this classification, about 18% of the sample is multi-context poor. And, you know, it's the largest category, the family economic poor, which is based, has the highest percentage poor, which is 27%. Okay, but we're going to mostly focus on this multi-context poverty indicator as an overall indicator of growing up poor. And one thing we point out is that this is not very correlated with consumption poverty measures, which are most often used by economists, that there's a lot of type 1, type 2 error here if you use this multi-context measure. And we show in lots of different types of explorations that the multi-context poverty measure has much more explanatory power, predicting many outcomes than just the consumption poverty measure. So we collect a bunch of measures of cognitive skills and non-cognitive skills in the various waves. And then we also look at adult outcomes, education, and incomes, which, you know, we care about as economists. And we focus on the 2000 poverty measure. So this was when kids are aged 9 to 12. And remember, Chetty said that you really care about the quality of neighborhoods before age 13. So we're using those as the measurements and try to predict the later outcomes. So the main advantage of this in terms of linking childhood poverty to adult outcomes in this data set is that we have this incredible richness of measurements. Really, we can measure almost any you can think of that might be important, but we still have omitted variable bias because we don't have the ability to identify off of movers like Chetty did, because most people grow up in the villas that they were born in. Now, one thing good about the China context is it's very hard to move. There's not much sorting bias. It's not like high ability people can move to richer villages and low ability people stay in poor villages, because no one can move because of the residential movement restrictions in China during this period when these kids grow up. On the other hand, we can't really avoid the problem of the omitted community factors that we don't measure, although we have lots of measurements, right? Although Chetty and some other work that I didn't report has found that the bias due to omitted community differences in the US is actually very small. So, so we're hoping that our richness of measurements will reduce the omitted variable bias. And we find some evidence that our neighborhood quality measures do pretty much act similarly to fixed effects measures when we look at their impact on the impact of family poverty measures on different outcomes, which is just saying that they seem to capture most of the important differences across communities. Okay. All right, so that's just background. Now the results, and I'm going to go through this very quickly. So we find that growing up poor has lots of impacts. So here we look at cognitive skill impacts in different years, and Chinese scores in 2000, math scores and literacy, and you can see that the biggest effects are on Chinese scores, and the effects are bigger than on girls than boys. So one consistent finding here we're going to get is that girls are more affected by growing up poor in China than boys. And that's in contrast to the greater sensitivity of boys to poverty in the US, but kind of makes sense in a Chinese context where you kind of feel that a very poor family will privilege boys because of some preference. And so girls may be much more vulnerable in poor contexts, right? And what we find is that this is the non-cognitive skills. We also find big effect differences, and especially this gender difference is quite pronounced. Externalizing behavior is like acting out, being unruly, fighting, this kind of behaviors. Internalizing is more drawing inward, being depressed, quiet, withdrawn. Again, we're seeing effects and gendered effects where girls are more sensitive. And here too, for later non-cognitive skills, depression and self-esteem measures, we also find the effects much bigger for girls than for boys. And then finally, we get education, which of course we care a lot about as economists, as the main kind of summary measure of human capital. And you can see we find, again, a pretty big gender gap in the effect of poverty on years of schooling attainment. And I'm going to jump and finish with that. So just to show that just for the US, we find that neighborhoods matter quite a lot in China, right? Oh, sorry, I wanted to show, I did want to show this. Okay, so if we look at, let's look at this education outcome. So when you break up that poverty measure into its components, the poverty in different domains, you can see that these family poverty measures are important, but some of these neighborhood measures are also very important. And together, they're perhaps as important as the family deprivation. Okay, that's the point I wanted to make. So this does show that the neighborhood effects matter. Okay, and I'm going to next go to a second paper, which is looking at the gender difference. And one thing good about the gender difference is that we can use family fixed effects and see how poverty affects boys versus girls in the same family, right? And that deals with a lot of omitted variable problems that we have looking at just general impacts of poverty, comparing poor households or poor communities to non-poor households, non-poor communities. It's a cross-sectional comparison ultimately, so there's still remaining bias, but there's much less bias if you're comparing boys and girls in the same household, right? So this gives a stronger identification strategy to look at gender differences. And here's what we find. The second column is the key one where, this interaction effect of female and poverty is basically showing that the effect of being poor on your years of education, you have 0.7 years less if you're a girl in a poor area relative to boys in a poor area. So gender and poverty matter. They both reduce, being female and being poor both reduce education, but the interaction is also very large, okay? And then if we break up this overall multi-context poverty measure into the family and community components, then we see that if we look at the interaction terms, female times family poverty and female times community poverty, we see that they're both negative. And this is without the family fixed effects. But when we control for the family fixed effects, we actually see that it's the community poverty that's different. So in other words, living in a poor community neighborhood in China affects girls in the same family much more negatively than boys in the same family. And then I'm going to skip this. We can even look at the different domains of these measures. One thing that's interesting is these village social measures, that male illiteracy rate will actually reduce the gender gap. because it hurts boys more. Female literacy rate will hurt girls more. So this all kind of makes sense. And fighting, just like in the US in bad neighborhoods, if fighting is more common in the village, then this actually hurts boys more than girls. So as a whole, village social does not actually hurt girls more than boys, but it's because of the specific measures have different gendered effects. Okay, and then we look at other stories. There's this gender poverty effect does not seem to be showing up in terms of the early birth weights. So it's not like the abuse is occurring at the time of birth, it's really later. And we also don't see a big difference in the actual parental investments in terms of the educational fees or the time spent by parents helping their kids. We do see that females in poor households may work a bit more in terms of the interaction effect in poor, but it's not statistically significant. But I want to show one. I have some time here. Okay, I'm going to go, with your indulgence, I'll try to go and finish by 12. I want to get to the punchline here. We also look at gender attitudes of the parents, which we have data on, both in terms of just family roles that they think boys should be bread earners and these kind of things, but also kind of expectation variables about whether parents think that they're likely to rely on their boys more in old age, or whether they think the returns to education is greater for boys than girls. Whether these are, and they all matter. I mean, they all are correlated with greater investments in boys compared to girls, but none of them really interact with poverty. They don't really reduce the gender gap in poverty. So this table looks at the sister-brother differences in the years of schooling. So the effect on the gender gap is, the interaction term before is really just the coefficient on this MC poverty variable in terms of predicting the gender gaps in education. And you can see controlling for these attitude variables doesn't really reduce. It actually increases the extent to which the gender gap is greater for oh, I'm sorry, this is the sister-brother gap. Yes, so it just increases the gender gap, it doesn't reduce it. So it's not the attitudes that are explaining it, it's not the investments in terms of the money spent on kids. So what is it? One thing that we did find, which I think is an important part of the story, is that if you look at the sibling structure in poor families and non-poor families and compare boys and girls, what you find is that in female male households, so the only difference, this is like within family differences, the only thing we find is this gap here, the minus 1.970 with 3 stars. What is that? That's saying in 2-child families, if the oldest child is a girl and the youngest child is a boy, then the boy's education is much greater than the girls. In fact, it's these oldest girls with younger boy brothers who have significantly less education than any other group. And it's unique to poor households. You don't see it in the rich households. So there's this oldest daughter story that seems to be driving the results. And we specify a regression to try to verify this. We can see, you know, when the first child is a girl in column 2 with at least one younger brother, you see this poverty effect being really, really big, right? For the oldest child, being the oldest child in this kind of a family, that the education is much, much smaller, right? Okay, so that's basically the main findings on the, oh, actually there is, oh, actually, I have some, oh, right, I didn't put it in here. Okay, so yes, we have another finding that this effect on older girls of being in a poor, for growing up poor, actually we did some more explanation and we found that, I'm sorry, this, yeah, this effect on the oldest girl. We find that this oldest girl effect is also mainly found in the quality of the schools. Then it's really driven by neighborhood effects, not family effects. And the neighborhood effect that's most important is the quality of schools. In other words, if you go to a bad school, if your school in the village is a low quality school, then the oldest girls really are not sent to school if they have younger brothers. It's this kind of a interactive story of poverty and the quality of schooling and the choices that parents make about the education of different siblings. And so all of this is also suggesting that the mechanism is not genetic. It's definitely clear investment choices by parents, because it's differential by the sibling structure, which means it's a conscious choice of parents to deprive specific girls of their education. So I'm going to stop there. Any questions?
Hi, Professor.
Yes.
When we estimate the Gini coefficient of high-income group, how to choose the threshold? Is there any rule or principles?
Yes. I'm going to stop sharing your screen. Actually, the existing literature doesn't make some pretty ad hoc assumptions to fit it. And so what I tried to explain, probably not very well, was that the methodology that Butaeva proposes is one where you try to pick a threshold where you can get the right-hand side fitted distribution to fit well with the left-hand side in terms of maintaining continuity at the threshold point, but also that the right-hand side fit to the data is also pretty good, so that it's trying to meet two criteria. One is to maintain the continuity with the rest of the distribution at the threshold, and then also to fit the existing data reasonably well. And to pick a threshold that meets these two conditions will make it, I think, be a more accurate and reliable estimate of the distribution.
I see. Thank you.
Other questions?
Yes, but Professor Park, I was wondering, could you please explain how, when you measure this multidimensional poverty index based on several domains, you said if the family or the child is poor in several domains, then you consider them as poor. So how do we establish this threshold of poverty?
I think some measures are continuous, obviously. So the thresholds are, I think we generally chose a threshold. I think for continuous measures, we just said the lowest 20% as the threshold. So if you're the lowest 20%, you're poor. For some measures like parents' education, we basically just looked at the distribution, and usually it shows like illiteracy or less than primary as, so it wouldn't, so sometimes it's depending on the choices, we just picked the lowest choice, but that wasn't always going to, the percentage would be, could be different, quite different on average. For the income and consumption, we use the actual poverty line for China as the threshold. For wealth, we use, again, this 20%. And for other types of categorical variables, we just usually use the lowest category or the lowest two categories if the lowest category was really, really, really small. So it's somewhat arbitrary, to be honest.
Thank you.
Right. So I see there's some questions in the, okay. Any other questions? Okay, well, thank you very much. And I'm sorry for kind of going over time, but hopefully this gave you a good sense of some of the research on issues related to the research on inequality and also this very interesting recent work on intergenerational mobility. Okay, great. So hope you guys are enjoying the summer school, and we'll continue tomorrow as scheduled. Okay, so long.